focus of our show is to share best practices from thought leaders in the B Corp community. Every week, we will focus on topics that fall into three categories: people, how to unify your team members behind your organization's vision and mission; processes, how to optimize the processes connected with certification or recertification; and finally, challenges, how to overcome the major challenges that are heading our way. Each week, we'll begin with a short micro training, and we will follow that by an extended amount of time for audience engagement. Many of you are joining us on LinkedIn Live, and when the micro training is done, I'll drop a link into the chat so that you can join us on Zoom for conversations with our guests and with all of our other attendees. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Ryan Honeyman to the stage. Ryan is a partner at Lyft Economy, a Bay Area based B Corp, and Ryan's also a fellow board member. And one of the things I love about Ryan is his ability to facilitate open and honest conversations. And this topic has been on my mind for a while. There's been a lot of conversations around the certification process, and it's causing feelings to be in several different camps. And Ryan has actually led the conversation around this. So, Ryan, I'm going to welcome you to the stage, and I would love for you to share with us what best practices you bring to our conversation today.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, so hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Honeyman. I'm a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy. Lyft Economy, we're an impact consulting firm of 7 folks. I'm been involved in the B Corp world since 2011 or so. I co-authored the B Corp handbook. Some of you may have read the book on B Corps. And I've helped over 100 companies with certification and recertification. And I'm also a member of the B Local board for the Bay Area. And so I think today what I'm going to talk about on the sort of micro training is going to be on building bridges, and in particular around a topic that is particularly recent and maybe raw for some B Corps, which is around Dr. Bronner's recent decision to decertify as a B corporation and how it went down. And so the framework I'm going to be talking about is something called the most generous interpretation. And so I'll explain that in a second. So to set it up, for those of you who don't know, and for those of you who maybe would like a reminder, Dr. Bronner's decided to decertify as a B corporation in February of this year, so only a month ago, citing things like the dilution of the standards, particularly around third-party eco-social certification. The way that they went out, though, they kind of talked about the B Corp community has lost sort of credibility and has really lost. They sort of were saying that the whole B Corp movement, in a way, was no longer credible or valid. And so many B Corps expressed a lot of frustration, disappointment, and confusion. Initial feelings were of surprise, judgment, and defensiveness about how this went out. But before I said anything, I took a moment to reflect on what I wanted to say, or sort of how I wanted to show up in this space. So what came to mind was a framework that I learned from parenting. So I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son. And one of the folks that I follow is, her name's Dr. Becky Kennedy, and she wrote a book called Good Inside. And she uses this framework called the most generous interpretation. And so the most generous interpretation as it relates to parenting, for example, this is maybe a common situation is like your child maybe has some challenging behavior, for example, if they're like wanting to have ice cream for dinner or something like that. And the way that you might react in a least generous interpretation way would be like, this kid is defiant. They're like not respecting me and all the time that I spent making this meal. Like, how dare you, basically. Um, the most generous interpretation, which is a lot harder for us to do, to look at that kid, might be, it's hard day after day to not be in charge of the food that goes in our bodies. um, and so it's kind of a reframing of, the good kid. This is a good kid having a hard time. So the behavior is more of the issue rather than the child itself. And so that reframing around the most generous interpretation allows more empathy and understanding and connection. And it does not, by the way, sort of excuse someone else's behavior. So it's not like if a kid wanting ice cream, if you take a most generous interpretation, it just means you give them ice cream or something. It's maybe saying like, I hear you want that, and it's tough. I understand. Like, you don't get to decide what kind of food you get every day, and I get it. At the same time, like, we're not having ice cream for dinner. So it's rather than being soft, it's actually looking at like what's most effective. So for Dr. Bronner's, what I did with their decision to decertify, some core concerns about whether multinationals can actually meaningfully change their behavior from B Corp certification. And a couple other things that I came up with. They're probably experience with B Labs, that they feel not heard, they feel ignored, and they sort of have felt like they're shouting into the abyss. And the last thing is they're activists, it's kind of their style. So what that did for me in taking that most generous interpretation was I was like, okay, I still don't agree with how they did it. And I don't really excuse the impact that it had on me and a lot of other folks in the B Corp world. Like, I still think it could have been handled way better, but it sort of grounded me in at least a more effective response than I think reacting from these are like egomaniac, self-centered, spiteful people. And so I think for those of us in the B Corp world, or those of us looking to have an impact in our companies, you can react. You can react from a place of least generous interpretation, which is, it's how most of us react. But if we want to be the most effective, I do think the most generous interpretation is really helpful to sort of think about some of these things. So, some of the benefits are things like, increasing empathy and compassion in your workplace, improving communication, reducing conflicts, and fostering collaboration. And so, if you really want to go deeper on this, there is the most generous interpretation framework, but I also just want to give a shout out to something called nonviolent communication. So it's Marshall Rosenberg has a book called Nonviolent Communication, and it's really like a much more formal process of like, how do you engage with people in a nonviolent way. Um, and so it emphasizes empathy, listening, et cetera, without judgment. It actually gives you like scripts and frameworks for how to identify the needs and get behind what someone is saying to really have like a more powerful conversation. So I think most generous interpretation is like my simple cut through. And then if folks want to go deeper, you could check out Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. So yeah, I think the closing and takeaway are, it can really this kind of mindset of taking a pause and really sitting with and trying to understand and connect with some of the reasons why someone does something, can transform misunderstandings into opportunities for deeper connection. And it can help us build stronger and more resilient relationships, both in the B Corp community, but hopefully in our other personal or professional relationships. And so I think that's maybe I didn't use the full 15, but I'm not sure, Anthony. That's about the gist of my talk today.
Ryan, that's such a wonderful conversation. For those of you that are still on the live stream, I've dropped into the live stream the Zoom link. So please click on the Zoom link and join us here on Zoom to continue the conversation. Ryan, a couple of things that I'm sparked by because of your conversation today, and then we'll open it up to the full crowd. But when this first came out, the news of Dr. Bronner, you were inspired to lead the conversation on this. There were a lot of back and forth, a lot of emotions in place. What prompted you to guide the conversation back to unifying communities rather than leaving them in a state of division?
Yeah, I think it was a couple things. I think I feel sort of a responsibility over like having been in the B Corp movement since 2011 and seeing sort of the arc of many things happen. I feel a responsibility to both give some context of like, here's how it's happened before, or like this is things that have happened, and here's how we navigated it. So I think there's a little bit of just like trying to be a little bit of the narrative arc of like where this fits in. That's one thing. Two, I mean, quite transparently, which I said in the podcast, like Dr. Bronner's is a client of Lived Economies. And so my business partner, Kevin, had been working with them, and we didn't know they were going to do this, this announcement. And, so a lot of it was like, scrambling to also reduce tension and ruffled feathers amongst multiple communities that I'm part of. And then I think three, there is, this type of framework of, yeah, most generous interpretation is a different way of looking at. It's just a different, I think, more effective way of looking at challenges that I think, I wanted to sort of put that voice in, as opposed to maybe adding in my sort of more negative or judgmental take on the situation.
Ryan, another thing, this most generous interpretation. You and I talked about this in the green room,
Yeah.
and I really like that. I mean, you invited everyone to use this as a meta skill for anything that comes in and potentially causes turbulence. And for me, I read the news, I read all of the comments around the news of decertification, and there was a point, and I'm wondering if we can zero in on the point. What could it take to step outside of one's comfort zone and start to see it from the other side? Now, for me, again, I had some upset, but one of the things that struck me when I started listening to the other side was they actually want a more robust set of standards. They're looking to elevate everybody's game in this space. So when I start hearing things like that, my upset began to decrease a little bit, and I began to see things with a wider lens. From your point of view, what's a good thing to do when we're mired in that initial upset, so that we can take a peek at what's over the fence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to be clear that I don't use most generous interpretation all the time. Like I'm very comfortable with
Mhm.
least generous interpretation. Least generous interpretation is often more fun because it's like, wow, they're such
Yeah.
idiots. It's like a us versus them mindset. And so I just want to be clear that like I only use this like on my best day, like 20 to 30% of any sort
Yeah.
of interactions. So it's really hard is one way. And then, how can companies use this? I mean, I hesitate to really think about this. But I feel like if there's also certain political or like broader situations happening with like, why does this politician do this decision, or why is this thing happening? I've tried to, it's very hard, but I've tried to do like, what is actually the most generous interpretation of this politician acting like this? And I think it does provide a level of empathy or understanding of like, okay,
Mm,
I see it from a different place. But the problem is that, especially in politics, sometimes I don't want to see it differently. It's like I want to stay in my I'm right, they're wrong framework. So it's
right.
actually, I guess I'm just a long, this is a long way of saying this skill set is actually like really, really hard to do because it requires us to step out of like the sort of normal way that we're used to viewing situations. So,
Yeah, and Ryan, one of the things I've realized over time is in a lot of cases, the destination is the same. It's the route that we take to get there that's different, and that's where the controversy lies. So I appreciate you just bringing this skill and just being vulnerable. It's not easy. We want to be right,
yeah.
but in that hard stance, it can create a barrier to understanding and getting back on the same page.